Hey,
Commissioner's here.
he is? Okay,
Yeah,
good.
bring him up now.
Can you get rid of the sandwich? Here's the order.
I did.
Oh, you did?
While you were over there talking.
Look at that. Perfect.
Tom, you mind coming over? Yeah, let's move that out of the way. Everybody ready? All packed in here? Everybody ready? Good afternoon. My name is John Lenzner. I am the acting United States Attorney for the District of Maryland. I'm joined this afternoon by Orville Green, who is the ASAC for the Drug Enforcement Administration and also the Strike Force Commander. We're also joined by Tom Carr, who is the Executive Director of HIDA. We are joined by Gary McElhaney, the Assistant Secretary for the Maryland Department of Public Safety and Correctional Services. We're joined by Commissioner Michael Harrison from the Baltimore Police Department, Chief Melissa Hyatt from the Baltimore County Police Department, State's Attorney Marilyn Mosby from Baltimore City, and State's Attorney Scott Schellenberger from Baltimore County. We are here today to announce at the Baltimore Strike Force an indictment against 11 wholesale drug distributors who were selling large quantities of dangerous drugs throughout Baltimore. Our goal with this indictment is to take down the upper echelon of dealers who are fueling the drug market and feeding addiction in our communities. On July 29th of this year, a grand jury in Baltimore returned an indictment charging Ronald White and 10 other wholesale distributors with participating in a conspiracy to import and distribute bulk quantities of fentanyl, heroin, cocaine, and other dangerous drugs. Over the past week, all 11 of the defendants have had their initial appearances, and the 11-count indictment has been unsealed. I should note that this is an indictment. It contains allegations, and all defendants are presumed innocent until their guilt is proven in court. As alleged in the new indictment, most of these defendants sold bulk quantities of illegal narcotics to other drug dealers in Baltimore. And the narcotics were then resold and made their way through the distribution chain until they were eventually sold to customers on the streets. In the context of the narcotics market in Baltimore, these defendants were closer to the upper echelon of dealers. All 11 of these defendants are charged in the conspiracy that's described in count 1 of the indictment. The defendants worked together buying and selling fentanyl and other drugs, which they processed and packaged in locations throughout Baltimore. In counts 2 through 11, individual defendants are charged with specific violations of narcotics and firearms possession, which stem from search warrants that were executed on April 29th and April 30th of this year in locations throughout Baltimore and Washington, D.C. For example, Kyle Page is charged in count 5 with possession of cocaine that he intended to sell, and he's charged in count 6 with possession of an M4 carbine rifle that he possessed in furtherance of his drug business. Ronald White, who allegedly sold bulk quantities to other dealers, is charged in counts 8 and 9 with possession of fentanyl and cocaine that he intended to sell. All of these defendants are alleged to be significant players in the narcotics trade that has plagued this city for too long. This was a strike force investigation that began in April of 2020 and involved all of the tools of our proactive gang investigations: wiretaps, undercover buys, surveillance, and search warrants. You can see to my left, to Mr. Carr's left, a chart that shows some of the locations that were searched back in April when we executed search warrants pursuant to this investigation. Specifically, investigators seized more than 4,000 grams of fentanyl, which is a staggering amount when you consider that just 2 milligrams of fentanyl can be lethal. They also seized more than 10 kilograms of cocaine, firearms, and more than $700,000 in cash. Keep in mind that these amounts that were seized were just on 1 or 2 given days. Over the course of the entire conspiracy over months, these defendants were moving large quantities, kilograms of narcotics. I should note that this is an ongoing investigation and additional charges are possible. I'd like to make 2 points about why cases going after wholesale distributors are important. First, our communities here in Baltimore, like much of the country, are being ravaged by opioids like fentanyl. In Maryland, we are losing close to 2,000 people a year. And in Baltimore City alone in 2020, I think we lost close to 480 people. We must remember that these are not just numbers. These are lives that are cut too short. These are all brothers and sisters, parents and children of members of our community who are gone because of fentanyl overdoses. Second, the excessive amount of violence that we are seeing in Baltimore again this year stems in part from the drug trade. While this indictment does not allege specific acts of violence, we know from many of our cases that many people who deal drugs also possess and use firearms to promote and to protect their drug business. We saw that in the CCC case that we announced in June, where a gang in East Baltimore was involved in selling drugs and also are alleged to have committed more than 40 homicides and shootings. And in this indictment, there are allegations of defendants possessing guns, including a rifle, in furtherance of drug trafficking. All of us standing here today spend a lot of time focusing on gun violence, and for good reason. But it is also a priority of the strike force to go after individuals and groups who are importing and distributing large quantities of drugs. The case that we are announcing today goes a long way to furthering that mission. And despite concerted efforts by all of our partners, the violence continues in Baltimore. And we're pursuing those who are driving the violence in Baltimore with proactive gang investigations, with our collaborative firearms initiative that we're handling with the State's Attorney's Office in Baltimore and the Attorney General's Office, and through our reentry and prevention efforts in Baltimore, including a job and resource fair that we hosted in July, where more than 250 members of the community participated. The investigators in our strike force are nimble enough to investigate wholesale dealers like these 11 were charged now, and also to go after the street-level organizations who are sourced and supplied by suppliers like Mr. White and his co-conspirators. This new indictment comes as one of the first strike force cases we charged nears its conclusion. In June of 2019, we charged 25 individuals for their involvement in 2 drug trafficking crews along the Monument Street corridor. That was the Montford crew and OTM. The charges included conspiracy to distribute narcotics, firearms, and money laundering charges. And I can announce that with the guilty plea 2 weeks ago of Malik Williams, 23 of 25 defendants have been convicted in those Monument Street cases. The final defendants are scheduled for trial in November. We focused on Monument Street due to the high levels of drug trafficking and violence in that area. And it is important for the community to know that what happens to these cases, how they actually play out months and years after we bring an indictment. It is also important for the community to know that we are dedicated to seeing these cases through to the end, to make sure that the charged traffickers who are bringing in large quantities are actually being held accountable and seeing time in federal prison. So in conclusion, let me add that the mission of the Baltimore Strike Force is to disrupt and to dismantle the most violent gangs and drug trafficking organizations in the Baltimore metropolitan area. The 2 cases highlighted today, one at its inception, one near its conclusion, reflect how the strike force is leveraging the resources and expertise of its member agencies to go after those who are bringing in large quantities of drugs, like Ronald White and his 10 co-conspirators, as well as street crews like in the Monument Street corridor who are selling those dangerous narcotics to consumers. I'd like to thank the DEA and the strike force groups for their terrific work on these cases. I'd like to thank HIDA for being a terrific partner to the strike force. I'd like to thank the Department of Public Safety and Correctional Services, who had 2 of their investigators in this strike force group handling these cases. I'd like to thank the Baltimore Police Department and the Baltimore County Police Department, who also had task force officers in these groups. And I'd also like to thank the Baltimore City and Baltimore County State's Attorney's offices for their collaboration and assistance with at least 2 of the defendants who were initially charged in state court. And I should add that the Baltimore County government is the fiduciary for the strike force, and so we're pleased to have 2 of their officials in Baltimore County here with us today. Let me just finish by giving a special thanks to the investigators who work in the strike force day in and day out. I note that this case that we're announcing today against Ronald White and the other drug suppliers began and completed during the global health pandemic, which really shows their dedication to making Baltimore safer for everyone. Also want to thank AUSA Lorraine Everett, who couldn't be here today, who handled this case as well as the Monument Street case. So with that, I'm going to turn it over to Orville Green from the DEA.
Thank you, Mr. Lenzner. This investigation exemplifies the outstanding work being done by the Baltimore OCDF Strike Force, and specifically by Strike Force Group 1. We collaborate daily with our law enforcement partners to target violent drug trafficking organizations across the city of Baltimore. Today's charges serve as a great example of the effective partnerships we forged and our commitment to protecting the residents of this great city. These 11 individuals represent the top-tier drug traffickers here in the city of Baltimore. They were responsible for supplying a vast number of drug shops across the city and fueling addiction and violence across the Baltimore metropolitan area. At least 4 of these defendants are repeat offenders who have completed lengthy federal prison sentences prior to being indicted in this investigation. Taking these prolific criminals off our streets is a step towards making Baltimore a safer place. I am grateful for our partnerships with the Maryland Department of Public Safety and Correctional Services, the Baltimore Police Department, Baltimore County Police Department. Here in Baltimore OCDF Strike Force, we will continue working with our federal, state, and local law enforcement partners to make Baltimore a safer place to live. Thank you.
Good afternoon. On behalf of the men and women of the Baltimore Police Department, I'm grateful for our ongoing partnerships, collaboration, and coordination with all of our partners in making Baltimore a safer city. It is collaborative efforts such as this performed by the Baltimore Organized Crime Drug Enforcement Task Force, Strike Force, that allows for the takedown of elaborate organizations that are plaguing our neighborhoods with violence and mayhem. This case is a great example of continuous collaboration and partnership with our law enforcement to help make Baltimore safer. Drug trafficking not only fuels violence in our city, but further victimizes the vulnerable demographic of substance abusers who've also lost their lives at the alarming rates due to overdoses. Our department remains focused and steadfast in working with all of our law enforcement partners to target and apprehend the suppliers and those involved in illegal drug distribution and carrying illegal firearms in our city. These indictments send a clear message to those involved in this type of illegal activity. If you make the decision to engage in this type of criminal behavior, we will utilize every resource available and bring the full weight of not only the Baltimore Police Department, but also our federal, state, and local law enforcement partners. So I want to thank the U.S. Attorney's Office and their Project Safe Neighborhoods program in reducing our violent crime and making our neighborhoods safe for everyone. And to all of our partners standing here with me today, our community thanks you for your continued partnership in bringing these individuals to justice and creating a better Baltimore for all. Thank you.
Thank you, Commissioner. I think we have time for a couple of questions.
How many agents and officers work on this strike force?
Orville?
Well, there are 7 strike force groups total that encompass all of the federal agencies represented here in the city of Baltimore: ATF, FBI, HSI, DEA, along with our state and local partners, state police, Maryland Department of Public Services, DPSCS, as well as obviously Baltimore City, Baltimore County, and a lot of other local departments across the state.
I'm just trying to get a sense of how many people that are within those 7 groups. Is it 25, is it 50, is it 100?
So within the 7 groups, it's a little over 100.
Let me ask you this question as well. The state attorney's policy is not prosecuting possession, and that's to keep low-level offenders from cycling through and they don't typically receive sentences. But are you seeing on a wholesale level, because selling is still being pursued, that's making it more attractive for buyers and sellers, that environment?
Well, I think we have challenges here in Baltimore, right? Because it's a huge user demographic that exists here. So while I think we all agree that we should be providing services for folks who are addicted, we're also targeting the individuals that are thwarting their recovery, right? So we will continue to target the individuals, the groups that pose a threat here in our city, and we collaborate with the state's attorney's office on pretty much the vast majority of our cases that we work.
I guess I'm wondering if you've seen any shifts, or not, since that policy was put in place last year.
No, we don't. We haven't really seen any shifts.
And Agent Green, what effects on the ground are you seeing after these arrests were made, and how big of a chunk is this from the total drug trade in the Baltimore area?
Well, we aren't able to sort of quantify a shift. There are numerous wholesale traffickers, like there are numerous retail traffickers in the city of Baltimore, and our strategy is to attack one organization at a time, or as many organizations collectively as we can at a time, and in combination with the Baltimore Police Department and the mayor's office, bringing some of those social programs that's actually going to be able to help us quantify the work that we're doing and the progress that we're making. But what we do here in the Baltimore OSF Strike Force is a small part of overall what it's going to take to make things better in Baltimore.
And the U.S. Attorney mentioned that this investigation was throughout the course of the pandemic. What challenges did you run into having a 16-month investigation in the course of the pandemic, whether it be just personnel here in the office or undercover guys? What kind of challenges did the strike force run into?
Primarily, it was with coordinating with the courts, with the prosecutor's office. Usually, that's a seamless operation, but now having to make appointments and to coordinate more than we normally would to get arrest warrants, to get search warrants, to get affidavits signed. That was what really made it complicated for us. The men and women in the strike force, the investigators, the law enforcement personnel were here and never took a break during the pandemic. They continued to work, but it was on the coordination side that was what posed a challenge, because it delayed us having to coordinate because of the pandemic.
The U.S. Attorney, I couldn't help but notice that the goal of this is to disrupt and dismantle the most violent gangs. Both the cases concluding in this case today did not involve any allegations of violence.
Yeah, let me clarify, Justin. So I said the goal, the mission of the Baltimore Strike Force is twofold. It's to stop the violent gangs in Baltimore, as well as disrupt and dismantle the drug trafficking organizations bringing large quantities into Baltimore. So there's 2 prongs. We go after the violent gangs through cases like CCC and NFL, and also cases like the one we're announcing today, as well as Monument Street. Those are the cases where we're focusing on the large quantities of drugs. Look, and as you know, we have some cases where we charge defendants in a conspiracy, and then we're able to go back and prove up some of the homicides and non-fatal shootings. And that just depends on, what kind of evidence we can come across. But these two cases that I'm talking about today certainly go to the second prong of the Baltimore OCDETF strike force.
You're not going to be able to answer my next question, but I'll try anyway. There was a large amount of money seized at a apartment building in Harbor East. Which of these defendants controlled that apartment? Or that?
Yeah, I think it's an ongoing matter, and you know the answer to the question. If I can just make one further point, though, something that when I've talked to members of the strike force, the men and women who actually work here day in and day out, one thing they've shared with me is that they, and many of them have been in law enforcement in Baltimore for many years. Many of them have not seen the level and degree of cooperation and intel sharing that we're seeing in the strike force now, where all of these agencies are sitting together and they're sharing intelligence and sharing information, and they're making connections between cases that we may not have made in the past. And I think that's one of the things that is different today than in prior years, and one of the things that gives us hope despite the very staggering numbers that we're seeing. Okay.
You mentioned Ronald White a couple times during your remarks. Do you allege he's the lead distributor in this case?
Based on what I know at this point, we know that Ronald White is a very significant drug importer and distributor in Baltimore. Sir.
I'm curious about the funds and the property that winds up getting brought in by the agencies. As you go through the investigation, what happens to all that money and property?
Well, we hold on to it during the course of the prosecution, and then at the end of the prosecution, when the evidence is no longer needed, just depending on the regulations, some things are disposed. If it's not illegal contraband, and if there's a rightful owner, it could be returned. Some things are forfeited. It really depends on the particular item and how it was used.
I was pretty much talking about the money, you can say, physical property, cars, things like that.
Well, I'm going to have to defer to my colleague, Mr. Green, here about that one.
Yeah. So all of that property gets turned over to the U.S. Marshal Service, who handles all the forfeitures, and it goes into an asset forfeiture fund that's then utilized and available to some of the agencies then utilize. But all of that gets processed by the U.S. Marshal Service.
Okay. Well, thank you all very much for being here today. We appreciate it. I think Marcy will work with anybody who wants to get B-roll in this right force.
It's okay.
You've seen a lot.
So I will tell you.